And I would like to welcome you all to this last DIAS lecture that we have this year. And it's by one of our senior fellows, Nina Bonderup Dohn. And she's a professor of learning and ICT, and she comes from the Department of Design and Communication. And she joined us here in DIAS in April 2018. And when you look at Nina's CV, then Nina has been, as she also, we just talked about it here before starting this lecture, she has been at several universities. She started and got her Cand. Mag. In philosophy from Aarhus University in 1998. And then she continued to Aalborg University and got her PhD in learning theory in 2005, and then she got her Dr. Phil in pedagogical philosophy here at SDU in 2017. But she actually joined us at SDU already as assistant professor in 2003, and she became associate professor at I don't know, we call it IDK in Danish in 2006, and then also in 2018 she became a full professor at IDK. When I look into Nina's background, then it's amazing. She has been doing a lot of different stuff, and she got her degree in philosophy, but then she also has physics as her second topic. And I think maybe that's why, Nina, you have been doing many different things during your career. So you've been dealing with physics and biology, and then a lot over in the humanities, human being, experimental knowledge, communication. You've been highly involved as a teacher and in developing our lecture training. In various pedagogical topics here at SDU. So you've been really many places, and that's. So I believe you are a truly interdisciplinary researcher. So I'm very happy to have you on board here in DIAS, and I'm looking very much forward to your talk. So with these few words, I would like to give the screen to you, Nina.
Thank you so much, Marianne, for that nice introduction. I'll be talking today about designing for situated knowledge in a world of change, and I'll do that by adding just a few words to what Marianne already said, or actually she said most of it, but just to set sort of the setting for my research interest and approach. And then I'll take up the basic question of this talk and ask, why is this a question worth talking about at all? Is it a question worth talking about, and what is involved in the question anyway? Then I'll talk about how to investigate the question, both theoretically and empirically, and make a brief detour to methodological virtues and vices of so-called design-based research, which is an empirical methodology that is that we have been using, me and my colleagues, in investigating the question. And then I'll give some answers to the basic questions, focusing on knowledge transformation across context, research into one specific example of a learning design aimed at supporting knowledge transformation, and some general design principles for designing for learning knowledge transformation. Marianne, as I said, actually said half of this slide already, my background, which is the top part. But you could say she said in a very nice manner that I have been all over the place. And so I also want to say, well, I've been all over the place, but with one focus, or with a set of focuses, which all have to do with bridging epistemology, that is philosophy, and learning theory, and doing that both theoretically and practically, and by practically I mean pedagogically in practice. So my main concern back to from when I did my master's thesis, actually inspired by what I experienced in physics, my main concern has been, what is knowledge? And this has led me to ask, how do we learn knowledge? And what is learning sort of comes out of that as well. And asking that question also leads to questions like, how can we design for others to learn knowledge? So those are my research interests, and that's a background I come with when I ask the question that is the basic question for this talk: how can students learn to put knowledge developed in one context to use in other contexts? This is a basic question of this talk. So one first question, maybe critical, maybe not, is why is this an interesting issue and for whom? And the short answer to give to this, because I have to be short and brief, I have so much to say and so little time to say it in. The short answer will have to be in terms of a crude characterization of current societal demands. We live in a world that is characterized by diversity and frequent change, by globalization, and people engage in and traverse many different contexts. Maybe not right at the moment, but we do, physically at least, but virtually we do still traverse a lot of contexts, both in a life-wide perspective, that means across our lives right here and now, and in a lifelong perspective as we grow older and change jobs and change leisure settings, take up new interests. So we all have lives in many different contexts, which means that we have to have knowledge learned in one context that we must be able to put to use in others. And actually, you could say our educational system is based on this idea of knowledge being learned in one context, being used in other contexts, because all our students come to us throughout the system from primary school and upwards. They go in one place or in some places called the educational system, where they learn something that they are supposed to not use in that system only, but use afterwards in a new context. So our educational system is based on knowledge learned in one context, it's being possible to use it in others. So for whom is it an interesting question? Well, it's an interesting question for us as education, and it's also an interesting issue, of course, for the people who have to traverse that, is everyone. The second critical question could be, well, yes, that's okay, I see that, but why not just concentrate from within the educational system on teaching students useful knowledge, and then transfer to other contexts as their worry once they have graduated? What we are good at is the knowledge we have within our system, so that's what we should concentrate on. And anyway, if the context knowledge that we have is useful and in depth, there should be nothing to worry about. Well, my answer to that critical question is, in 3 words, knowledge is situated. I'll say a little more than those 3 words. Empirical studies show that cognition, or knowing, when we are showing our knowledge, is a relationship in action between between the person knowing and environment, and includes tools and people present. For example, Hutchins and Clausen have made a really interesting study of early on distributed cognition in an airplane. They did it in an airplane simulator, but still how the different pilots use the tools and each other and the communication between them to together as a distributed system fly the airplane. And Jean Lave has done interesting studies of people in supermarkets, how they judge what is the best buy for them. And one example is a person who wants to buy a cheese, who instead of sort of calculating the price per gram, simply takes the cheese in his hand. This was before Corona. You could pick up the things you were going to buy, picked up the cheese, and sort of just, oh, this one is much heavier than that one, I'll take this one because they're almost the same price. So that kind of best buy judgment by using what is present in the environment is a relationship in action. That's what meant in these empirical studies. The studies also show that knowledge is locally realized and negotiated, influenced by the aims and norms of the social practice in question. So if you have 2 apples and 2 pears, if you ask what is 2 apples and 2 pears, well, what's the answer to that? Is it 4 pieces of fruit? It would probably be that in the school system, but if you're trying to make an apple pie, the answer might be ruining the apple pie. So depending on what your aim and your aims are, what knowledge is in this situation is negotiated as either rather you could say answering 4 pieces of fruit is going to be wrong if what you want to do is do an apple pie. Okay, you could say from the critical question point of view. So I accept this. Knowledge is applying a piece of knowledge to local conditions, taking the aims and norms into account, sort of like this. You have a piece of knowledge and then you put it into context. And the other way around, maybe you could say that learning involves abstracting what is the essence and taking it out, and then you can then put it into use somewhere else. So if that's the case, then still, why not concentrate on teaching the students these useful pieces of knowledge and not and stop worrying about the context stuff? Well, that's the question. Can we really look at it this way? Is it really the case that knowledge is just plugged and played like this? Empirical and philosophical studies show that knowledge gets content and structure from the situation. For example, if you consider the role of math in school and in the supermarket, there's a context, to just give some simple example, there's a context dependency of what counts as a unit. If I'm buying apples for my apple pie and the apple pie says 4 apples, then it's a correct evaluation for me to say that, oh, okay, these apples are small, these 2 apples and these 3 apples, they make 4 apples. And you could also say what, whereas of course, if I'm in the school, adding 2 plus 3 has to give 5 in most situations, at least, depending, no, well, anyway. And as regards the right result, well, in school, the right result would be the right result to 2 plus 3 is 5, and the right result if you're doing a school math problem about supermarkets, the right answer to the question of which apples to buy would be the cheapest buy with good quality, and you can sort of calculate that. But in the supermarket, you might be looking at the apples and say, wow, they are really not very good looking this time. I think I'll have dessert. I'll have ice cream for dessert. So the right result in a supermarket, because your aim is to buy for a dessert, you might change your mind about what you're actually going to buy. So the right result might be ice cream to the question of how many apples you should buy. So in essence, shop tasks and school shop tasks, they differ. And it's only from the school's point of view that it's the same math task. From the school, from the supermarket's point of view, or rather from buying stuff in the supermarket for what you want to do with it at home, getting something home that you can cook from that is going to please the ones you're cooking for is the criteria, are the criteria that you put that you evaluate the right result in as regards. And so that means that it's not the same task from the supermarket's point of view. What is going on in school is not the same task. So another way it's not like this, that you could just have a knowledge essence that you apply to local conditions. Instead, knowing and competence is acting adequately in relation to the unique complex of possibilities and requirements of the situation. Now, so what I'm arguing is that this is not the case, but rather that we should see knowledge in context as a whole, which is transformed into, in other contexts, into another kind of whole. So saying you accept this, the third critical question would be, why worry about this? Because you could argue that people have always traversed context. This is nothing new, and they've succeeded in reusing knowledge. Why should we worry about transfer? So you could give examples of people you know who've been playing badminton earlier on, and then when they started playing tennis, they were much faster at learning tennis, even though it's not the same. The ball is much heavier. Still, they were much faster at learning to play tennis than people who started from scratch with tennis. And you can find primary school learners who do exactly the math problems in the supermarket. They'll be stopping and saying, "Mom, I think you should buy that one over there, because if you buy, or rather you should buy 3 of those, because then you'll get them for 15 kronas per piece rather than paying 20 kronas per piece." So you can have experienced that as well. And of course, our graduates, once they get out of school, out of our education, they get employment, and they can come back telling us that they use the knowledge that we've taught them, some of them at least. So if this is not the case, then maybe this is that we teach them pieces of useful knowledge and then they sort of transform it a bit when they plug and play it in different contexts. And so you could reiterate the second critical question: why shouldn't we then just still concentrate on teaching students useful knowledge, and then they can worry about the transfer once they're finished with their education? Well, I agree, of course, that some people manage some of the time to transfer it with some tasks, but it's not everyone who manages, and they do not. No one does it always, and none of us do it with every task. It's certainly not all primary school learners who do math in supermarkets. Some of them find it really hard to do math in the supermarket and in school, but also even if they can comply with it in school, they do not transfer it to the supermarket. It's not everyone who transfers skills easily. I'm a fair driver, I think, in Denmark. I've been living in Sydney for half a year, and I hated driving by car in Sydney because they drive on the left-hand side of the road, and transferring my right-hand skills or right side of the road skills to left side of the road skills was not easy. And I've never tried, and I never will try to drive in Rome, because the way they very acutely take the situation into and take small chances that everybody knows they will take, and if it works fine, I'm not able to do that. That's not the way I drive with my Danish leisurely driving skills. And there are plenty of studies, more seriously perhaps, showing that students often experience gaps when they go from school to work, and they experience gaps in how to actually apply their knowledge to work, and not because the knowledge was bad, but because they have to transform it to the setting in question. So one shouldn't, just because you can give examples of people actually being able to transform their skills and their knowledge, one shouldn't say that this is all, there's no problem. On the other hand, you could say that one basic aim of education, of course there are more, but one of them is to support students in learning what they need for their present and future lives, for their own sake and for society's sake, because that's where they are working, and for the sake of the activities they engage in, so that they become as competent as possible. And what I've argued is that being able to transform and resituate knowledge is both important and cannot be taken for granted. So it follows from there that an important educational aim is to support students in learning to transform and resituate knowledge. So far, I've argued that the basic question of this talk, how can students learn to put knowledge developed in one context to use in other contexts, is or ought to be interesting for us in the educational system, because knowledge is situated and needs to be transformed and to be put to use in new contexts, and this cannot be taken for granted. And we are educating for a world where context crossing is an integral part of life. Okay, so I hope I've convinced you, and I can't see you. Well, I can see some, I can't see much of you, but I hope I've convinced you that this is a question that's worth asking. But what exactly does the question ask? Is this a question about knowledge? Is it about learning? Is it about pedagogy? Is it about transfer? Well, it's all of that and more, which means that it's hard and it's in plural. It's a philosophical question. What is involved in transforming knowledge? What is knowledge? How does knowledge transform? What do we mean by context dependency, to name just a few of the philosophical questions? It's also a learning theoretical question. How do we learn to transform knowledge? And it's a pedagogical question. How can we support others in learning this? So how do you investigate this question? Well, as I said, it's both a philosophical and a learning theoretical and a pedagogical question. Philosophically, you investigate concepts of knowledge, context dependency, and transformation. But what is philosophical investigation anyway, methodologically speaking? Well, this is a talk in itself, and actually that is what my Dr. Field dissertation was about. My Dr. Field dissertation is an argument in theory and practice, through actually applying it, for a way of conducting philosophical investigation. But since I'm not giving that talk, I'll here have to say just that Philosophical investigation is what it is often sort of belittling said. It's a conceptual armchair analysis, but it's a conceptual armchair analysis in dialogue with empirical examples like the ones I referred to before, semi-empirical everyday examples considering what happens when you go to the supermarket yourself, phenomenological observations of how it feels to apply knowledge and to be skillful, obvious counterexamples, common sense observations, analysis of critical analysis of the presuppositions involved in empirical examples, semi-empirical examples, phenomenological observations, obvious counterexamples, etc. All of that adding together, detracting some, finding out what fits better to what roles in a different context, called a reflective equilibrium. And in this philosophy, that's the argument of my Dr. Field dissertation, acts as a dialogue partner with other sciences with a voice of its own. Enough said about, for now, what philosophical investigation is. Learning theoretical investigation here, in investigating the basic question of this talk, involves theoretically analyzing the implications of empirical research on situated learning, which are studies such as the ones by Lev and Hutchins and Clausen that I referred to before, the supermarkets and the distributed cognition in the fly simulator. It also involves developing and synthesizing different theoretical approaches to knowledge transfer and to transformation. And it involves developing design principles for supporting learning knowledge transfer and testing those design principles in practice through pedagogical investigations, which in our case has primarily focused on empirical research and utilizing design-based research methodology. And this is where I do a little detour, saying a little bit about what design-based research is and its virtues and vices. Overall, the methodology of design-based research consists in designing a solution to a problem in a natural setting in collaboration with practitioners and investigating that design. So, and it's a dual focus. It's the design is doing this, designing the solution and investigating in a natural setting is a means for investigating a research question. It is also an attempt to solve a real-world problem for the practitioners, or together with the practitioners. And one example would be a real-world problem of students actually not being able to transfer as much knowledge from the school context as was expected, which the studies I mentioned earlier on shows is a problem, a real-world problem. And through trying to solve this real-world problem with a design, with a design for learning and a new way of teaching or new way of designing learning conditions, you can investigate, for example, a research question about the preconditions for and the barriers to knowledge transformation. So design-based research is a form of Modus 2 research, as it's been called, which means it's applied research rather than foundational research. And it involves experiments in situ, which has positives and negative sides to it. One virtue, or a virtue of doing experiments in situ, that is in the natural setting where that you want to know something about, one virtue of that is that it actually gives you epistemological access to investigating a phenomenon which might otherwise not exist. For example, if you want to investigate a new specific teaching method and that no one teaches with that method, well, then designing designing the method and investigating it in situ with the practitioners is a way of investigating how the cognitive potential of actually using this teaching method. It also gives you access to a phenomenon which might be hidden or invisible to you because that's just the way practice is. Kurt Lewin said that if you want to truly understand something, try to change it. That can be interpreted in many ways. My interpretation of it, I think what he meant, was that if you try to change something, you will find out the barriers that are existent that you do not see because they are part of the background of your practice, but they become visible once you try to change them, just like the way you notice a wall by running into it. Of course, a vice of doing experiments in situ is the complexity. It's difficult to isolate variables, and it's really difficult to evaluate the effect of the design because the design is not the only variable, and arguably it's not one variable. The design is a set of variables together with a set of other variables, and it's really complex. But on the other hand, if you do try to isolate the variables, that would be missing the whole point of doing in situ investigation. But it's certainly a complex question. Design-based research is also, as I said, characterized by collaboration with practitioners and involvement by the researcher in practice, maybe even as participation. And a virtue of that for the researcher is an in-depth understanding of the context you're involved in and close-up observation of effects of design, which may counteract the problems of isolating the variables because you simply get a much deeper understanding of the context. On the other hand, the vice the complementary bias is bias on all sides. Your own researcher confirmation bias. I made this design. I'm thinking it's going to work. I'm sure, lo and behold, I find that it works. Pleasing bias on the part of the students that you're investigating. They know you designed it, and they see you're there, and they want to make you happy. So that's the pleasing bias is there, and your collaborators want to make you happy as well. So they are biased as well. And another role is, or another vice is that it's not always clear what your role is vis-a-vis the practitioners, and it must be constantly renegotiated. If they know you know something about this, then it's not once, it's not twice, it happens all the time that the practitioner will, if you're sitting as an observer, they will ask you, what would you do here, which you're not supposed to. That's not the role. You're not supposed to step in as a teacher, but that's since you're there, and it has to be always negotiated what the different roles actually are. As I said, it's also design-based research is also characterized by having two aims: research and improvement of practice. And the virtue of that is that societal relevance of research is much clearer because you're taking your outset in a practice problem. But there's also obviously a tension between these aims, and the tension emerges continuously and often leads to tensions between the collaborators, and this is where you have to again negotiate your different roles. Enough said. That was a detour. Some answers to the basic question. The basic question again, what was it she was talking about? She's talking about how can students learn to put knowledge developed in one context to use in other contexts. And as indicated, there are many parts to the answer, and I shall concentrate on only a few. I'll concentrate on how should we understand context dependency, which is a theoretical question. How should we understand knowledge transformation, also a theoretical question. I'll give one example of a specific design, how that fares in supporting knowledge transformation, and I'll say something about general design principles for supporting learning knowledge transformation. And this means that I'll leave out answers to, for example, what is knowledge? How do different knowledge forms transform? How can we support different types of context crossing from within education, and empirical results from many other investigated designs? So how to conceptualize context dependency? My conclusion before on the knowledge is situated part was that knowing and competence is acting adequately in relation to the unique complex of possibilities and requirements of the situation. And context dependency is this unique complex of possibilities and requirements. We've developed a framework of 5 analytical levels for analyzing the unique complex of possibilities and requirements. I'll concentrate on the 3 first levels in this talk to simplify matters and to keep time restraints. The first 3 levels are firstly the domain level, where a domain could be algebra, and you could say a requirement within algebra is that 2 + 2 = 4. And the second level is the activity level, what you're doing, how you're engaging with the domain. So an activity could be determining what is the best buy, and a requirement would be that you would concern the price per unit, that the best buy is the lowest price per unit if the quality is the same. And a life setting level is the third level, where two examples of life setting levels are the ones I've been giving up to now. The school situation where you have a school task, or the supermarket where a requirement in the supermarket would be I can transport it home, so that even if you find out that it would be cheaper for you to buy 5 large packages of toilet paper if you're on your bike, then that is the solution of buying the 5, even if it's cheaper in the long run, is not a possible move for you, because it's going to be highly dangerous to do that per bike. The requirements and possibilities at these different levels interact, restrict, and define each other. For example, to take the example again, what is 2 apples and plus 2 pears plus 2 bananas? Well, in the supermarket, it might be your solution to filling up your fruit bowl, or it might be annoying that they only have 2 apples left because you want to make an apple pie. In the classroom, most usually this equals 6 pieces of fruit, but of course it depends on what you're doing in the classroom task. And sharing the fruit bowl between your kids, the answer might be a large dispute and a fight between your kids if they all only want the apples, and you've got more than 2 kids and only the 2 apples. So the requirements and possibilities are at the different levels. They form a complex unity of situational demands, and context dependency is this complex unity. This helps us conceptualize knowledge transformation, because knowledge is realized in attunement to the unity of situational demands. For example, in finding out what the best buy is in the given life setting, so that the best buy may be the 5 apples that equals the 4 that you need for your recipe, or it may be buying the ice cream instead, because the apples are not really good, and you know that your kids like ice cream just as much anyway, and it saves you the trouble of baking. Or it might be the best buy solution that the school task is setting you. So this requires realizing knowledge in attunement to the unity of situational demands, requires flexible knowledge at all levels, and situated readiness, you could call it, to integrate it into a specific whole, that you are ready in a situated way to integrate your knowledge into a specific whole. So this is not the case. Rather, you could say this is a case that within the context within the whole of the context that I drew before, you can differentiate the domain level and the activity level and the life setting level. And transfer of knowledge to a new situation requires attunement to the different unity of situational demands of this new situation. That is, it requires resituation of knowledge, leading to a transformation of knowledge. So how does this context level framework help us to conceptualize knowledge transformation from the holistic knowledge and context to another holistic knowledge and context? As I said, it does so by letting us distinguish between the levels. For example, we can focus on a transformation at the domain level knowledge. This is what happens when we transform math in school into math in the supermarket, making the role of math visible in the supermarket, in the activity of buying, and within the life setting of the supermarket. Or you can transfer at the activity level, for example, a group discussion. That's why it's the same color, purple here. The activity being a group discussion. In a group discussion, quite generally, you would expect everybody to be allowed to have a say, but the way you have a say is different if you're discussing a math problem versus if you're discussing a texture analysis. So the activity of having a group discussion will transform between, even for the same students, between students in high school, for example, if they have a discussion about a math problem in one class, and then they have a different and they have a discussion of a texture analysis in a literature class later on. And you could also have combinations of these. So knowledge transformation is helped in being conceptualized with the context level framework, because you can analyze how the transformation occurs between the different levels in taking the situational demands of the whole into account. And this is what my colleague Roland Hachmann has done in his then PhD study. He was then my PhD student. Now he's a postdoc at our department, and he investigated a specific learning design with utilizing this framework. What he investigated was the teacher education. He investigated a first language course and utilized the design-based research approach. The practice problem that was the outset is the experience problems that students have in connecting their curricular learning from the school, from the teacher education, with the professional practice that they need to work in later on. And the students experience the problem, the teachers experience the problems as well, and so do the professional practices in which students come in. So it's a documented practice problem, you could say. And the design he made, and in collaboration with the professionals at the teacher education and at a primary school, was that the students, as part of their course within the teacher education, were to teach a module in a primary school class on a topic that they had in their course. So in the present case, they learned about the dramatic arc for textual analysis. They learned about that in the teacher education. That was one of the topics. And they then taught that module within a primary school class. And this allowed Roland to investigate research questions such as how do situational demands transform between the two life settings, and what knowledge is transferred between the two life settings, and how is it transformed and resituated. He did this by participating as an observer in all of the classes within the course at the teacher education and all the modules at the primary school, because the students were teaching in small groups. So there were many modules, even though one student would only have a module once or twice. He participated as an observer and video recorded all the classes. He did focus group interviews with the students after they had performed the primary school modules, and he analyzed the student essays. And his analysis of the change in situational demands point towards the change within the educational program at the teacher education. The students are students, and the educator there at the teacher education has authority in the course. So whatever they do as students, and the teacher educator is the one to say what is right or wrong and what is debatable. At the primary school, this is an ambiguous professional setting for the students, because they come there and are delegated the authority as teachers, but they're delegated the authority as teachers as a practicum experience. So they're not real teachers, that teachers there as a practicum experience, which is which is shown in, for example, the real primary school teacher, even talking about her as a real primary school teacher, or the ordinary primary school teacher, shows the problem or the ambiguity. But she would say on beforehand to her pupils in the primary school, please behave nicely towards these teacher students when they come, so that they can learn. They are here to learn how to teach. So you must help them by behaving nicely. And actually, the students did behave nicely. The teacher said nicer than they usually did. On the other hand, when you analyze the communication, you can see that they, in several spots, challenge the authority of the students, the delegated authority, by teasing them and making comments that they probably wouldn't have made in a similar fashion to their own teacher. Roland also finds knowledge transfer, or he finds knowledge transfer, looking at this situational demands, he finds knowledge transfer at both the domain level, the dramatic arc, and at the activity level. At these two pictures, you can see the students here within the within the teacher education module, they are doing a storytelling relay where basically you throw a ball, and the person who gets it says the next line in the story, invents the next line in the story. And the students transform this to the primary school setting, where they also make a relay with the students. they have to transform, and they do transform the knowledge of the dramatic arc to the lower academic levels of the 5th grade and the needs of classroom management. So they change terminology. They introduce they ask the students to make a drawing, which then they of different episodes in the story that they're working with, and then they use these drawings to show the dramatic arc. So they explain the dramatic arc by way of the drawings, which was not the case in their own teaching. And they also need to monitor and ensure requirements of storytelling. They pause the relay several times here because the students are, or rather the story that the students are producing is deteriorating. It's not following the dramatic arc. So they have to monitor and manage the relay, which is not the case at the teacher educational program, where their teacher is in charge. This transformation is, these are just simple examples of the transformations. Roland finds a lot of them, and very often the transformation is not explicitly reflected or given a justification in what we in Danish would say fagdidaktisk begrundelse, which in English you could say the justification in terms of the subject matter itself. But this does not mean in itself that it's unqualified, that the transformation is unqualified, that they do not explicitly reflect on it. Might just be a case of the transformation being what we call the situated readiness of of listening to apprehending the situation and reacting, transforming in response to the demands of the situation without explicitly being aware of doing so. Though, of course, some of the transformation that the students perform could and maybe should be challenged, of course, because the students are still learning. They're not experienced teachers, so it's not everything that they do in response to the situation that is actually justifiable. And the final finding that I'll say something about here is that the students do not consider the knowledge, they are not focused at all, at least explicitly, on the knowledge transfer and knowledge transformation. They find that their most significant learning outcome is simply the classroom management experience. So where what was in focus was the subject for Roland and the teacher educators. That was the primary school. That was the first language knowledge and the subject matter teaching theory of the first language, and how that could transform from the teacher education to the school. But this is not what is in focus, at least explicitly for the students. What is in focus for them is simply the classroom management experience, having real students there that they have to be in charge of and get to and to teach something. Now, this was just one example of the empirical studies we've done. In the general design, some general design principles for supporting knowledge learning knowledge transfer, which draws on all our empirical studies as well as those of others. You could say that from within education, it's important to utilize what you could call expansive framing of the subject matter of that is of what you're teaching. That is, articulate the relevance in out-of-school contexts of the subject that they and the learning that the students are doing in both a life-wide and lifelong context. So articulate how what they're learning could be used in other contexts. Within also another general design principle is to design for back and forth traversing between school and out of school context, ideally in collaboration with the out of school practice, which was what Roland did, collaborating with the primary school. He designed for the students to traverse this from the education to the professional practice. If you cannot do that, then simulating the practice within school is, and thereby supporting what you could call mediation or transition is also an option for supporting or a design principle for supporting learning knowledge transformation. In particular, we want to focus on designing for use and reuse of across contexts of materials and perspectives and activities, like the students did in Roland's case of with the materials of the dramatic arc and the activities of the relay. And in designing for this, also here utilizing expansive framing from within school of how the materials and activities could be relevant in out of school practice, and also from out of school practice articulating how what is happening there is relevant for the school context. So also supporting with the expansive framing both ways in this traversing. Prioritizing practice evaluation criteria and assessment criteria is important, because otherwise the out-of-school context will, doing a task for a company, if you do not prioritize the company's evaluation criteria, then you're saying, well, basically it's all about what's happening in school, and this is just an interesting case for you, but what really matters is the school knowledge, and you're focusing back into the school rather than helping students traverse and transform their knowledge. And you should also design for the students' reflection on transformation, but beware of creating secondary reflection practices. You can become very good at reflecting on what good practice is without actually being a very good practitioner. A lot of I think we can all think of people who are very good at saying how teaching should be, and maybe not so good at teaching themselves. And also, last point, last design principle, if you only focus on development of knowledge in class, that is often detrimental to learning knowledge transformation, because you focus only within the school and you do not help the knowledge transformation. And actually, that makes it harder. What we often think of as educators is obviously relevant, is not obviously relevant for our students. So if you do not explain, if you only concentrate on knowledge within class, it can be really difficult for them and make it to actually see that. And even if they think this might be relevant, then they think, no, since it wasn't articulated, then it probably isn't. And this is why we cannot concentrate only on teaching our students useful knowledge, which was, again, the critical question number 2. Why can't we just teach them useful knowledge and then where they can do the transfer later on? Well, the problem is that if we only do that, then it can actually be detrimental to them learning knowledge transformation. So, in conclusion, my time is running out. How can students learn to put knowledge developed in one context to use in other contexts? Well, I've been arguing that knowledge is situated and context dependent. It is realized in attunement to a unity of situational demands, and this unit is analyzable in a framework of 5 demands. I've concentrated on 3. The attunement requires flexible knowledge at all levels and situated readiness. Transfer of knowledge to a new situation requires attunement to the different unity of situational demands in the new situation. That is, it requires resituation of knowledge leading to a transformation of knowledge. And within education, we can design for students learning to do this by designing for that traversing of school and out of school context, by requiring them to utilize materials, perspectives, and activities across this context, by utilizing expansive framing in both school and out of school contexts, and by prioritizing practice evaluation criteria in assessment, in our assessment criteria in school. My talk here has drawn significantly on the project Designing for Situated Knowledge in a World of Change, which has been funded by Independent Research Fund Denmark, and therefore on the work of my colleagues in this project, colleagues at SDU and also at Aarhus University and Aalborg University, and at internationally at University of Sydney and University of Wollongong from Australia, and the Velten Institute in the Netherlands, and Linköping University in Sweden. And my colleagues here from SDU, you see here, Jens Jørgen Hansen, Stig Børsen Hansen, Roland Hachmann, whom you've met on previous slides, Michael May, and Jesper Jensen, who's happy, lucky, or the color of hope. They are all from my department, and Søren Harno Clausen from the Institute of the Study of Culture, and Rie Troelsen, who is leading the Center for Learning and Teaching at SDU. And this was it. Thank you for your attention.